What's going on, football fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for Week 9 of the NFL season. Gonna get you ready for all of your exposure Sunday. But first off, a breakdown of the Draftkings side and what we're doing for our DFS lineups. Those include my top 4 quarterback stacks, game environments that I'm getting well over the field on. Also, some value plays and strategy involved when looking at the game theory side. And then afterwards, we're gonna focus on the pick'em and the prop side with a few Underdog and PrizePicks props that I've already gone out there and mixed in. And by the end, a few pieces of exposure you might want to go out there and tail yourself. So you'll have a complete game plan of what to do for Sunday. And we got a lot of information to go through here, so let's not waste any time at all and go ahead and hop on in. Our first quarterback stack is going to be Josh Allen and the Bills going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, and this is going to be an absolute barn burner. We got a 52.5 point total between these two teams, and both are Super Bowl contenders this year, so I think a lot of eyes are going to be in that game in the late window, but for fantasy purposes, it's a gold mine as well. A lot of people are going to be using Patrick Mahomes. He's actually about 10% owned in the large field GPPs, so although Josh Allen's going to be the quarterback stack that we're focusing on here, I will have some exposure to the other side of this game. Just at those higher ownership marks, it's better for single entries or cash, where we don't have to worry about duplicating ourselves. We don't have to worry about getting nearly as much leverage into our builds. But in large field GPPs against 50 to 100,000 other entries, Josh Allen is my quarterback of choice. And it partially comes down to the quarterback ownership, which is just 4% as opposed to nearly 10% on a Patrick Mahomes. But some of the stacking options are even lower owned as well. Just like Kansas City, you've got a whole lot of targets, a whole lot of mouths to feed on that offense, which makes it hard to narrow down just who's going to go off. And because of that, a Shakir, a Coleman, a Kincaid, a Knox, pretty much no matter who you use on that Buffalo side, is going to be sub 10% owned. And even on the flip side, you have a couple players like a Kelsey, a Rice that are getting some ownership for Kansas City. A lot of those secondary players like a Worthy, a Juju, a Noah Gray, a Thornton, a Hollywood Brown are going to be sub 5% owned. So even with the buybacks, you have spots where you can get that differentiation. Within the stacking option itself, you of course have some players that are sub 10% there. And if you throw in a sub 10% or a sub 5% or then a Josh Allen at sub 5% at quarterback, not only are you getting access to one of the best game environments that we have, if not the best game environment that we have of the week, but also at lower ownership than the average. So that's why I prefer that side. Still like some Patrick Mahomes in my exposure. It's just that the lower ownership and the leverage opportunity really makes Josh Allen the better play in my opinion. Next up, we got Jared Goff going up against the Minnesota Vikings. The Detroit Lions are the favorites in that matchup, one of the bigger spreads that we have of the week. And though the total is only at 48.5 points, Jared Goff and the Lions side, because of the big favorites and the spread favoring them, they've got one of the highest team totals of the week. And oftentimes we look to the running backs on Detroit when they're in this kind of situation. Players like Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, who are still some of the better plays that we have of the week. But I don't like sleeping on Jared Goff, who's got all those targets at wide receiver and tight end to work with. One of the best supporting crews in all of the NFL, if not the best supporting crew at wide receiver, tight end, to running back. Whether it's a J-Mo, you got an Amon-Ra at wide receiver, a Laporta at tight end, and Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield with that receiving threat. He can go for 300 yards or 3 or 4 touchdowns real quick. And at $6,000 at only 3.2% at the quarterback position, there's an opportunity for some leverage here as well. On the other side of the game, we have JJ McCarthy, who is expected to be starting for the Vikings this weekend. He's only $4,900. He also has some rushing upside, and you can see his ownership's not out of hand either. So just like the first game, I'm going to be playing the other side of this game environment as well. But at least because of the skill position players on the Lions, the projection being a little bit more favorable on Goff as it is compared to a JJ McCarthy, he's the one that we're putting down as a core play. But some of the stacking options do have some ownership in this game, like for example, an Amon-Ra St. Brown. The running backs for Detroit are going to be a little bit chalky, but on the other side of the game, as long as you're avoiding like your Jeffersons, your Addisons, a Hawkinson is going to be relatively low owned. The running backs for the Vikings aren't going to be extremely popular. A Jalen Naylor is going to be sub 3 to even 4% owned in large field GPPs. That on top of a Jared Goff, who's only 3.2% owned himself, gives you opportunities to get that differentiation. So one of my favorite quarterback stacks and game environments for the large field GPPs, not so much in cash and single entries. Normally in cash and single entries, I'm looking for a little bit of a safer play when it comes to points per dollar projection. And Jared Goff, it's worth noting, is only at about a 3.03x points per dollar mark, which isn't terrible for a lot of the slates that we've had this year. But with all the quality quarterback plays that we have for week number 9, it doesn't stand out quite as much as guys like a Caleb Williams. So that's why the ownership is inflated on guys like Caleb, who's nearly 12% owned. But don't sleep on that game environment. That'll be the last game environment that we go through here together. I still actually like Caleb Williams quite a bit this week. Third quarterback stack going to be Aaron Rodgers going up against the Indianapolis Colts. This is also one of the higher totals that we have of the week at 48.5 points, just like that second game stack that we went through. And that's really what we're looking for with these top game environments is, productive offenses, teams that are going to keep it relatively competitive. If we get a shootout, if we get a total that goes over that already inflated total, then that's where we're going to find some of these ceiling performances. And Aaron Rodgers has had a fantastic start to 2025. I'm a Steeler fan. I've gone to see it first case pretty much every single week and has been way more effective than I thought he was going to be. So against the Colts, who have been a pretty decent defense to start this year, I actually like the matchup quite a bit. The Steelers are underdogs that should force them to pass the ball quite a bit in the second half. And on top of that, you've got a relatively close spread. It's only a 3.5 point spread between these two teams, not expected to be a blowout towards Indianapolis. And as long as it's competitive, that should keep Indy throwing the ball, helping them for their fantasy purposes. And on the flip side, it's going to keep Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers engaged as well. And they've had a lack of running game, particularly in the red zone. Jaylen Warren has not scored over the last 5 straight weeks. And it's been all the A-Rod show, which is why for fantasy purposes, it makes a whole lot of sense. It's a very concentrated offense between the DK Metcalf that you could use for some stacking options. You have a Calvin Austin who's come back, but a lot of players on that offense that are at most like 3 to 5 percenters. Maybe that second, third wide receiver that you're using alongside an Aaron Rodgers. It's a lot of A-Rod to Metcalf, a lot of A-Rod to maybe a Calvin Austin, and then one of those other two players. But for the vast majority, it's going to be DK that we're stacking up with him. On the other side of the game, we also have a lot of buybacks that make sense. Jonathan Taylor is nearly $10,000, but he, of course, is one of the best projecting plays that we have on the slate. A Pittman, a Pierce, a Warren, or a Downs you could use as a pass-catching option on the other side. A Warren's going to be pretty chalky at the tight end position, but guys like an Alec Pierce, a Josh Downs at wide receiver, you're looking at sub 5%. And on top of an Aaron Rodgers, who's only 2.6% himself at quarterback, there are some spots to get that differentiation. And a DK Metcalf's not going to do that on the Pittsburgh side. He's going to be that one piece of chalk that you'll be stacking on Pittsburgh. But any of these other wide receivers, including a Calvin Austin, he should be sub 5% in GPPs, will get you some of that differentiation. And then lastly, the last stack we're going to go through is going to be Joe Flacco going up against the Bears. It is also worth noting that I am playing some Daniel Jones. So just to go quickly back to the last stack, Daniel Jones is a little bit more of a rushing threat though. So unlike an Aaron Rodgers, where I went 2 pass catchers in every single lineup, it's the same thing with Jared Goff, by the way. Jared Goff does not have as much rushing upside. So I went 2 pass catchers every single time. Somebody like a Daniel Jones though, at $6,200, I would play with only 1 pass catcher. But this last quarterback stack is going to be another one of those statues that doesn't run very much, and that's going to be Joe Flacco going up against the Bears. This is another high total. It's in fact the second highest total that we have on the slate at 51.5 points, sometimes 50.5, depending on the sports book that you're looking at. But Joe Flacco has been extremely effective ever since getting to the Bengals. He has all the wide receiver options that you could possibly want. Jamar Chase has been getting spam targets the last couple times out, but even Chase Brown has been a little bit more effective. A T. Higgins had his first big week in like a month. Noah Fant, a Yoshi Voss at that wide receiver position. He's got kind of like a Jared Goff, one of the best supporting casts in all of the NFL, and that really helps him out with his fantasy production. The other side of this game as well with the Chicago Bears, they've got a willing dance partner there, a team that's been a lot better to start 2025, an offense with Caleb Williams that has taken a step forward, partially because of their offensive coaching and having Ben Johnson leading the thing. Caleb Williams is going to be the more popular side of this game, but a Joe Flacco who's slightly lower owned at 7.2%, who also has the more elite pass catching options to lose along with him, is the player that I prefer. And Joe Flacco for me is probably not going to be as much of a large field GPP play because 7% ownership. Jamar Chase, by the way, is going to be like 30% owned in large field GPPs. It is going to be a pretty popular game stack if you're going with some of the premier options here. But in single entries and cash formats where the differentiation isn't as much of a deal, he's going to be one of my favorite plays. And it has a lot to do with kind of like a Patrick Mahomes. He fits that same kind of description where he's a fantastic play. 3.35x points per dollar projection. A lot of pass catching options like Kelsey and Rice, they're projecting through the roof. But if you're using him in a big large field GPP, you're just going to be playing against like 20 to 30,000 other entries where you're playing like a 4-on-4 or 5v5 for the rest of your lineup, which is not an ideal situation to be in. If a Josh Allen goes nuclear, I'd rather have that get there in the large field GPPs. And it says a lot of the same about a Joe Flacco down here, is he's going to be a little bit high owned. If you're careful about it, a T. Higgins should be one one of the lower-owned stacking options that you could use on Cincy. Fant Yoshi Voss are going to be sub 5% owned, but you play this quarterback stack for the Flacco Chase combination, for the 10 to 20 targets that he's gone over the last couple weeks, not so much for the secondary players. So that's my personal strategy when deploying this sort of a lineup. But Caleb Williams on the chalky other side of this, also one in my player pool for some of my single entries and cash lineups. And now for the prop on the betting side, where I've got a couple slips you might want to go out there and tail. And we're going to start on PrizePicks with the 6Xer. It is a 3-leg slip. And first off, I got a Deebo Samuel over on receiving yards, who is for the Sunday Night Football slate, so technically not the Week 9 main slate, but did want to sneak this in there as it is a piece of line value. He's at 50.5 on Pinnacle and juiced minus 140 towards the over. In fact, he was even minus 150 towards the over last night, so this is some pretty heavy line value. And most of the other major books out there, he's at 51.5 or even 52.5 yards. So that's a 2 to 3 yard discrepancy there. And with Deebo Samuel having a 5.5 reception line on books, this is just far too soft a projection. This year he's averaging about 9 yards per reception, which is well below his career baseline of about just under 12 yards per reception. So with a 5.5 reception line, I've got him closer to a 60 receiving yard line as opposed to this 49.5. And even if he uses the 5.5 receptions that give him 9 yards per reception, like he's had in 2025, that's exactly 49.5 yards. So this is at worst a very fair line. If he uses career baselines for yards per catch, it is value comparatively, which is why I'm taking this sort of an over. It is a tough defensive matchup against the Seahawks. Should be a close competitive affair. What we worried about with the Washington offense is them getting a little bit rushing heavy if they're playing from way ahead. If they're up by 3 touchdowns, it's going to be a whole lot of JCM and some of the other running backs like McNichols during that second half. But if it's competitive or a one-score game, or God forbid, the Washington Commanders are playing from behind, and that's going to lead to a lot of passing usage for him. So that's why I like that over. A little bit of plus EV value compared to the sports books as well. Can never hurt you. Next up, we got Aaron Rodgers over at 1.5 passing touchdowns. And speaking of plus EV value, he's minus 146 for his over on FanDuel. And on a site like DraftKings, he's minus 131 towards his over. The other sports books have him at about that minus 130 to minus 135 mark. So getting close to the true plus EV mark. And of course on FanDuel at minus 146, well across that threshold. They've got a high total between the Colts and the Steelers, a 48.5 point game. Also a spread that's only 3.5 points favoring Indy. So the fact that the Steelers are underdogs could lead to some extra second half passing usage, but the Steelers have been extremely passing heavy this year. In fact, almost all of their touchdown equity has come through the air. Over the last 5 games, Jalen Warren has not scored anything on the ground over that kind of stretch. Kenneth Gainwell's had a little bit more success, but even then, the ratio of passing touchdowns to rushing touchdowns on the Steelers is the most drastic that we have in all of the NFL. And you've got the Indy defense that is stout against the run. So I think it's going to spur on some extra passing usage when they get into the red zone on a team that is already one of the most passing heavy teams when they get to that section of the field. So 1.5 passing touchdowns with that juice towards the over also made quite a bit of sense. And then finally, you have a Kamani Vidal over on touchdowns. And this doesn't have a lineup on sites like Pinnacle quite yet, but when the odds drop for Vidal, I'm expecting him to be juiced heavily towards the over. He's expected to be operating as the running back 1 for them again. You have Haskins hurt. You have, of course, Najee out for quite some time at Hampton, who's going to be down for quite some time as well. So Vidal's got over a 75-yard rushing yard line on the books, and other guys that have a 70-plus yard rushing yard line are almost all goblins to score. And you do have Justin Herbert juiced like minus 200 to go over 1.5 passing touchdowns, but let's remember that the Chargers are one of the bigger favorites of the week against this Tennessee Titans team, and their team total, though the total of the game is in the mid-40s, it's not one of those 48.5 points, not one of those 50-point totals that we talked about with the fantasy section before, but their team total is one of the highest on the slate because of how big of favorites they are. So a Kamani Vidal, I will gladly take to score. They're expected to be in that positive game script, which will lead to some extra second half rushing usage. And considering how effective he's been over the last couple of weeks as being that fill-in running back, he's been the most effective running back that they've had the entire season. I think that this is an extremely reasonable take. And in fact, when we get the odds for him to score, it would not surprise me if this became a goblin prop a little bit later on in the week, which is why we're mixing it in right now. And if we take these 3 plus EV leans, the last one technically isn't yet, but I think it will be once we get those odds. We're getting a full 6x payout. And a lot of times when you're taking these minus 130 to minus 140 juiced props on a site like Hard Rock Bet, DraftKings, or FanDuel, you're going to be getting closer to a 5x payout, a plus 400 payout on the parlays, the single game parlays, if you're using that sort of payout method on the sports books. And we're getting a full 6x payout, which is a plus 500 parlay here on PrizePicks. So a little bit of value that we're mixing in there. And now let's look at the underdog side. And for the underdog side, we're going to be taking 3 fades for fantasy points. And if you haven't caught some of my content on the underdog side quite yet, these fantasy point props, especially on Underdog specifically, are usually inflated, and that has to do with their half PPR scoring. If you take a look at the scoring here, you'll see reception is only worth half a point. You also, if you lose points, if you lose a fumble, and you lose a whole 2 points on Underdog compared to some of the other sites where you only lose 1 fantasy points, these projections should be significantly lower than what we have on PrizePicks. And when we do the comparisons from site to site, you're going to see that they haven't adjusted them quite enough. So let's start with the Romeo Dobbs here. So Dobbs, if we go over to PrizePicks, he's at 10.5 fantasy score. An Underdog, where we're taking the under, this is the better spot to do it again, he's only 0.05 points lower. And with the fact that it's half PPR scoring, if you take a look at his projections, he's at 4.5 receptions. That should be a 2-point difference, yet it's a 0.05 point difference. So we're essentially getting him at like 12.5 fantasy score on a site like PrizePicks. And if you take a look at his lines here, he's got a sub 50 receiving yard line. If he's only going to get you 4 catches, that's essentially what this projection is calling for here. That's an extra 2 points on top of that, so that's 6.75 points. And then you have the touchdown equity on top of that, and you may say, oh, touchdown equity surely has to be worth like 4 to 5 points. Not when you're expected not to score, right? He's got a 0.77x multiplier towards the under. That means that he's minus 200, probably even worse than that odds not to score on the sports books. So let's say it's 50-50 odds. Let's be as favorable as we possibly can about it. Again, he's not 50-50 odds to score. He's probably closer to 30% odds to score on this sort of a game. We give him the 50-50 odds. We give him the 3 points to score a touchdown, and that's 9.75 points right there. That is as good as a projection we can give him. In fact, let's give him an extra 0.25 points just because we'll give him the whole 4.5, not the 4 receptions at the sort of a number. And that's 10 points right there. It's under that 10.45. And that was us being extremely favorable with the kind of projections that we're giving him. So that's why I'll take that under. It's pretty much touchdown or bust on these sort of players. If they don't score a touchdown, they've got to get you like 80 yards, like 6 catches to go over that sort of line. And there's a reason why their 50-50 marks on those sort of benchmarks are at 47.5 or at 4.5 receptions, as opposed to 6.5, 7.5 reception lines that he'd have to go over that sort of thing. That's why there's value on these sort of projections. So that'll be the first one that we mix in. The second one's going to be this Wan'Dale Robinson under, which isn't quite as much of value compared to PrizePicks, but I still think it's value to take for this category. So you'll see if we look at his PrizePicks line, he's at 12 fantasy score. He is only at 10.05 on Underdog, but keep in mind that Wan'Dale Robinson is at a 5.5 reception line, so he's still about a point value comparatively between the two different sites. And just like we had with the first matchup, he is heavily juiced not to score. In fact, he's a 0.69x multiplier towards the under for him not to score on Sunday. He's only got a 50.5 receiving yard line, and though his reception yard line is a little bit higher, these possession PPR heavy wide receivers like a Wan'Dale Robinson really get screwed on Underdog. That half PPR aspect completely tanks his projection from website to website. He's not a big touchdown guy either. And though this is a relatively high total game, the Giants are the underdogs. The San Francisco defense is typically one of the better units that we have. A lot of injuries on defense has made them more of a middling unit this year, but even then, not a complete pushover on that side of the ball. And if he's going to be nearly minus 300 not to score, we don't have the odds on him quite yet. On a site like Pinnacle, it'll have the yes and the no odds. But if he's like minus 300 not to score, I hate to say like you don't worry about that touchdown equity, but you don't, right? Especially on a 50-50 prop like this. If he scores, you deal with it, you lose the prop, and you move on, and it's not the biggest deal at the end of the world. But for the value and the 50-50 perspective on the sort of lean, it is a clear value towards the under. So at 10.05, I'll be mixing that in as well. And then lastly, we've got this Cortland Sutton under on fantasy points. And just like the first few, this is also a slate value compared to PrizePicks. And if you bring up his projection for Sunday, he's at a 12 fantasy score, so it's about 0.85 points higher. But just like the first couple, he's got a 4.5 reception line. So in reality, that should be about a 2.25 point difference from player to player, and it's only that 0.85 difference. So that's why there's some value on the Underdog side for this fade. And just like the couple, first few we've gone through, he is heavily juiced under to score, and he is a better wide receiver than the first few that we went through, a true number one for Denver. However, and this is a big difference compared to the first few, the matchup is horrendous. The Texans have been the best defense that we have in the NFL, whether it's on the passing defense or on the rushing side. They let up the least amount of points of anyone in the league. So that 0.7x multiplier towards the under is about the same as we've had on the first few players, and that's the reason for it. He is a better player, is more of the alpha dog when you get into the red zone, but because of how stout they are on that side of the ball, they're not expecting the Denver Broncos to post like 4 to 5 touchdowns. So if he doesn't score, he's got the 56.5-yard receiving yard line, only a 4.5 reception yard line. It is going to be extremely tough to cover this. In fact, let's assume that he got us 6 catches, so that'd be about 3 fantasy points right there. He'd still have to post 85 receiving yard line just to go over that sort of thing. And again, that's well over his reception line if he were to do so, and it's well over his receiving yard line, and he would only be getting close to the 11.15 right there. So that's another under that I'll be playing for Sunday. This is also a 6x payout when we're mixing these in, but because Underdog's a little bit more stringent on these multipliers, on PrizePicks we have the Goblin and the Demon props, but they're not as prevalent as what we get on Underdog. Usually a lot of the plus EV value, like with the sportsbook lines, we're finding on PrizePicks because they're a little bit slower to adjust to those and they don't have nearly as many multipliers. But Underdog is where we get some of these wacky categories, like the fantasy points that are mispriced, rushing touchdowns, first downs, receiving targets. It'll be heavily different compared to some of the other books out there. So Underdog's where I've been targeting some of those unique categories, some of the ones that you don't see on some of the sports books, and PrizePicks where I've been attacking some of that more traditional value. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the DFS and prop preview. Make sure to check out my Patreon page for all the content for the main slate. That'll include the DFS sheet that you saw before. NFL DFS tier will give you access to that. And also for all the props that I'm entering on Underdog PrizePicks and on Hard Rock Bet, the NFL prop tier is how you get access to that. There's a link down below to get access to both of those tiers. But for a chance to earn a free month for everything that I have on my Patreon page, just give me your top scorer for Sunday. If you get the top raw scoring player on the Sunday main slate, you'll win a free month access to everything that I have over there, including the DFS projections, the prop stuff that I was mentioning before, but also all the golf stuff that we have here during the fall swing. But that's all I've got, guys. I appreciate your support of the channel as per usual. Smash that like button if you guys haven't already. Also subscribe to the channel so you guys don't miss any of the content to come. That'll include our Monday Night Football preview, main slates throughout the rest of the year, and all the island games covered here for Showdown. But that's all. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you guys here throughout the rest of the year.